There you go. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping while people are kind of coming in. There's closed captioning in Zoom. It's the little CC button in your toolbar. So if you want to experience closed captioning or live transcripts, you can hit that CC button and you'll be able to see that. I have images in my slide deck, but for the most part, they're purely decorative. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to explain them because it would be redundant. As a Quaker, I believe and wish that peace resides in all of us. And I want to let everyone know that I think violence and war are never the option. So I want to hold in light all of those people in the Ukraine and the Russians who are shocked and dismayed at the course their government has taken. And I just want to remind all of us that that is still in our midst and is still happening. My name is AmyJune Heinlein. I am currently the open source, I'm this community manager at opensource.com. If you want to share an open source story or an open culture story, just let me know. I'm on that editorial team. You can find me across LinkedIn as Volkswagen Chick, across Twitter, actually across all of the spaces as Volkswagen Chick. Also, you may hear my cat because my doors are slightly shut. His name is Spot. He's really cute. He might come up on the desk. And then we also have Pantera, who I want to be inclusive and mention her, but you will never see her. She's in the closet, maybe, I don't know, but that's Pantera. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to go over some basic accessibility concepts along with some more specific guidelines that have to sorry, I have a little bit of COVID brain, so I'm gonna slow down a little bit and catch my breath and start that again. We're going to look at some basic accessibility options or concepts because I don't want to assume anyone's skill level or knowledge base. So I just want to touch upon some concepts. And then I'm also going to talk about specific guidelines that pertain to some of the security stuff I'm going to talk about. And then we're going to look at those security options and talk about some alternatives that we might have instead of those. So we have the Wcag guidelines. These are the web content accessibility guidelines. And it's really a goal to have a shared single source of web content accessibility guidelines. It's for web content developers. It's for folks who write our accessibility evaluation tools. And it's for web authoring tool developers. And really, it's for anyone who wants or needs a standard for web accessibility. POUR is an acronym for 4 high-level concepts that describe functional accessibility. We have perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And for brevity, because this is a shorter session, I encourage you folks to look up those. But to break it down, what makes our content accessible? We want to make sure that it's easy to see, so we accommodate the visual needs of all of our consumers. The Center for Disease Control reports that around 12 million people 40 years and older in the United States live with some sort of vision loss or impairment. And that's including about a billion people who are blind. But remember, there's other factors, to think about when we talk about visual needs. There's glare, our cell phone screens are cracked. Motor needs, we want to make sure our digital assets are easy to interact with. People who live with palsy from Parkinson's, or perhaps paraplegia from ALS, or, they got into an accident. But it could also be people with temporary setbacks, like when you're on a city bus holding a baby and you only have one hand. We want to make sure it's easy to hear, so we accommodate auditory needs. We want to address those needs to help people who are in noisy environments, as well as our deaf or hard of hearing friends. And then the last broad concept is, make it easy to understand, so we accommodate cognitive needs. And this can include people who are distracted, or have a difficult time focusing. So it's not just those permanent disabilities, it's those situation and temporary disabilities as well. So into the content of the talk, accessible authentication. Authentication is really our first defense when it comes to security on most of our assets and websites. When authentication requires user input, the best practices should include giving all of our users options and choices. And this is going to be a recurrent theme. We want to make sure that we give our users options and choices. And then here's that specific Wcag criteria I was talking about. This has to do with authentication. Ensure there's an accessible, easy to use, and secure method to log in and undertake tasks. And this benefits people, again, with cognitive issues relating to memory, people who have dyslexia, people who have dyscalculia, which is sometimes processing numbers, issues processing numbers, and then people with perception processing limitations should be able to authenticate, validate, regardless of their level of their cognitive abilities. So there's some 3.3.7 talks about accessible authentication. Gated content. This is a lot of times we have behind we want people to give us information to access these assets. It requires a user to complete a form or purchase a subscription. And gated content can be any kind of online materials like white papers, articles, videos, again, anything that requires our users to fill out a form before they can access those assets. And this can include forums to exclusive communities, along with access to surveys or contest entry forms. I want to talk about some of those common security measures. We see Captchas all over the internet, but what are they exactly? And I didn't even think that this was an acronym until last year when I was doing a talk about accessible images. So Captchas are completely automated public Turing tests to tell computers and humans apart. We've seen these as simple as something like in this image. This image shows the checkbox that says, "I am not a robot." Sometimes we see them as images, or we have to listen for letters, maybe even do a simple math puzzle. But we need to remember that not everyone can see the screen and identify images. When we talk about standard image accessibility, we include alternative text, but providing alternative text really defeats the purpose of weeding out those machines, because you've provided the words, and those bots are now able to parse it. Sometimes we have simple questions like 4 + 2 =. Again, this can be challenging for folks with cognitive processing issues. We want to make sure that we offer alternatives to Captchas that are accessible for our entire audience, including people with vision, hearing, and neurocognitive disabilities. Timers or time-based authentication is very common when we think about security. There is another, Wcag guideline around this, and that's 2.2. We want to provide our users enough time to finish their tasks. Not everyone can zip through a form or enter their credit card information at top speed. So make sure that that timing is adjustable, or that there's no timing. Be sure if there's any sort of interruptions that they can be postponed or suppressed by our user. When an authenticated session expires, we also want to allow the user to continue the activity without losing the data that they've already entered, before they have to re-authenticate. And then make sure certain users are warned of the duration of any user activity that could cause that data loss. We've all been there where we've filled out a form and we went to go do something. I need to let the cat in, or the baby is crying, and I come back and it's reset, and I go look at the form and everything's empty again. So, think about that as, if I had a button to extend my session before I went and did those activities, that would be really handy. People with disabilities may require more time to to complete some of these activities. And again, those time sessions can cause problems. You know, someone who has a reading disability like dyslexia can take longer reading the form and understanding the instructions. You know, someone who is deaf may be more comfortable with sign language than the written word that's on the screen. So that can slow them down because, you know, they might not comprehend the text on a web page. And this also includes folks whose English might not be their native language, or whatever language they're reading isn't their native language. This can apply to folks who rely on screen reader software. You know, maybe they're blind, or maybe have a vision impairment or a learning disability. It could take them more time locating all of the elements on the page or understanding the page layout. And unless the time limit is longer than 20 hours, all time sessions should be able to be turned off, adjusted, or extended, unless it's essential for the activity, which, you know, sometimes people say, you know, like an auction or buying tickets where your tickets are on hold. You know, again, you know, think about whether or not that's really necessary to the essential, you know, process of whatever the digital asset is. Time-based one-time passwords, I've seen that as an acronym, TOTP. These codes, you know, this is input that people have to get from a source and enter into another space. This code input might hinder some people who you know, have to think about sight issues or cognitive or motor skill impairment. You know, it might be difficult for some people who have cognitive processing issues to take code from one screen, like their cell phone, and put it into another screen in the designated time allotted. I know I've looked at a 6-number code, tried to memorize it, and then put it into my Drupal.org authentication and messed it up and then have to reset again. You know, sometimes those authenticator applications and messaging apps aren't always compatible with screen readers either. Again, turn off the timing, adjust the timing, or extend the timing on those inputs. And what are some other verification methods for making sure we are who we say we are? Biometrics. Biometrics is a technical term that refers to physical or behavioral traits. You know, we have voice recognition, and I'm going to say what these are and then talk about some issues that might come about when these are your only methods of authentication. So we have voice recognition, but like me today, I have a sore throat, or maybe my microphone isn't working properly, so it won't pick up my voice as I had tested it with previously. Facial recognition. It does not require sight, hearing, or significant motor skills, making it ideal for many users. But, you know, think about head coverings, you know, face coverings, beards grown during COVID. This can affect, you know, our biometrics over time. Fingerprint scanning. I garden, you know, perhaps you have chapped or a dirty finger, or maybe someone doesn't have, you know, the limbs that it requires to use a fingerprint identification. And then, you know, think about the buttons that we have. Maybe somebody has palsy and their fingers are shaking and it doesn't register right on that sensor. And eye recognition is really the best biometric that we have. It's great. It's very sophisticated. It can tell twins apart because it uses the iris for matching. But, you know, over time, you know, some folks might have cataracts or maybe a sudden loss of an eye. Biometrics are great, but I just wanted to introduce some ideas of why some of these things don't work over time. We have MFA, multi-factor authentication. We have things like text messages, you know, SMS, we see it, you know, texted codes. They may be a bit less secure than authenticator apps, but they're a common solution for their ease of use and sort of their wide availability. The trade-off may be worth it for your users. Maybe you have users who have difficulty typing codes quickly. Screen readers and text-to-speech functions are more likely to work seamlessly with a native app, like texting. We have email-based authentication. We have connected tokens. These require users to plug in a dongle or a USB device. It may require a second step like pressing a button or using a biometric challenge, but they don't usually require users to input a code, making that MFA process more accessible for users who live with motor or visual or cognitive differences. And then there's single sign-on. We see this as SSO. And this significantly reduces friction by only requiring one login action session. Across your sites, like at Red Hat, I log in with my email and I have a single sign in, and then I can log into all of my apps automatically because I've signed in once. But it still has some of those issues at first, as most of those multi-factor authentications. I just want people to think about scanning our IDs and our certificates, thinking about our bank applications, our vaccination records. If we're going back to conferences, some of us have to upload vaccination records, certificate-based signatures like PDFs. Sometimes folks with palsies are unable to hold the document or user agent still enough for the computer or app to scan. Think about when we take pictures, when we deposit a check, we have to hold the phone steady. A person with low vision may not be able to line up that scanner or put the document in focus, So I'm not sure what those alternatives are, but I want folks to think about that, users experience scanning these identification certificates in different ways. And passwords, what do we do with hidden passwords? To make hidden passwords a little bit easier to navigate, we want to make sure that we label our form controls. Something to think about is allowing copy and paste functionality. I know that sometimes when I'm submitting a session to a website, I type in my email once and then they ask me to retype in my email, and I would prefer to just copy and paste it, but they make you type it out, and some people that's a burden. Allowing tools to fill in credentials for our users is a great alternative to it's a great way to make those hidden passwords a little bit easier. There's a picture up here where we have a hidden password where it allows the user to show the password. That's a great way to help our people, navigate entering that password a little bit easier, but not all of our websites have this. This is a Google email. So a couple notes about alerts, modals, and other pop-up-y things. One, they're annoying, but all of us know that, really think about whether or not you need a pop-up to begin with. But there is a whole principle around this kind of thing, and it's the operable principle. I talked about those core principles. Our user interface components and navigation must be operable. So there's target size. These are those little boxes, those little X's that we have when our modals and our pop-ups come up. We want to make sure that someone on a mobile phone who might have large fingers can close that window, or people who have a palsy and they're using their mouse, they can target that close button easily. Focus order, can the user tab through the whole page? Or I'm sorry, when we talk about those pop-ups coming up and someone who's only a keyboard user, do they have to tab through the whole page to get to the X to close that pop-up? We want to make sure that if that pop-up comes up, that is in focus and people can easily close that button. Can a keyboard user navigate into the dialogue, in that pop-up? And then when they navigate into that pop-up, can they get out? We'd want to make sure that there's no keyboard traps. And really an accessible modal or dialogue is one where the keyboard focus is really managed properly. The correct information is exposed to screen readers. HTML and ARIA can be used to provide the necessary semantic information. And then, think about CSS and JavaScript managing the behavior as well. JavaScript pop-ups should only be used if they add significant advantages and functionality. They should still be able to function even if JavaScript is disabled. You know, some people live in rural spaces like me and don't always have CSS and JavaScript enabled in our browsers. You know, so if the pop-up opens a new window or a new tab, or this is a different concept, sorry. If the pop-up opens a new window or a new tab, then label the link that it will open a new tab or window, because many users are confused when they don't realize a new window is open and they're unable to use the back button. We want to also make sure that we avoid disabling scroll bars and resizing options in those pop-ups. Our users with low vision may need to resize the windows to accommodate if they bump up the text size a bit. And then one last little trick is to provide a no script alternative that uses a plain link to direct users that might have JavaScript disabled to the appropriate information. And status messages have their own little special guideline as well. This is 4.1.3. Make users aware of important changes in content and do so in a way that doesn't interrupt their work. So this has to do with error identification, labels and instructions, and error suggestions. Provide a means to turn off non-essential alerts. They are distracting for some folks. They take focus away from some folks. And so sometimes coming back into the content is harder or impossible to do. We also want to make sure that if we use color or hidden icons, that they're not the only means of conveying important information. Not only for colorblind folks, but also for people who have a glare on their screens. And so to wrap it up, you know, I'm going to kind of iterate again what we learned today. We always want to provide our users with alternatives, and remember that there's all different types of disabilities. There's situational, temporary, and permanent. And again, AmyJune and it's Volkswagen Chick across, you know, social media like and LinkedIn. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me on social media, and then I'll give the link to the slide deck to the Stanford folks so they can share it on the website, because I do have links for additional information and some links to some useful tools for testing your security measures that are free or open source to the public. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and have maybe a couple minutes for questions, because I have a little